It had rained in the morning, and by some delicate conspiracy of weather and city grime, the afternoon brought a peculiar polish to the pavements of Westbury Gate. The street was short and rather too discreet for commerce. Its town houses, with pale stone facades and bright black doors, seemed to have formed, over a century of minor scandal, a confidential alliance with their owners. In one of these houses, a wide, reserved building, its fanlight starched with etching, Lady Isabel Lansing held what the invitation had described as a private view and a charitable tea. The guests called it Isabel's paper party, and felt that this was charmingly frivolous until the paper materialized. It did so, in transfigured shape, as roses, hundreds of them in bowls and garlands and an arch over the stair. They were too faithful to nature to be merely clever. Some were bruised at the petal edge in that particular pallor that belongs to certain garden roses and certain disappointments. Others kept the petal curl with a discipline that suggested a secret wire. The effect was both extravagant and reticent, like a girl's room after a proposal declined in good form. At 4 o'clock, when the lamps were lit in protest against a watery sun, the guests began to arrive in that composed manner of people unwilling to appear eager for any sort of entertainment. The footman, who enjoyed a correct Roman profile only when seen from the right, took coats and murmured the ritual of names. In the drawing-room, a careful tea had been set out. Teacups thin as excuses, sandwiches with their crusts disciplined into absence, a cake whose lemon icing had been persuaded into gloss with a little hot water and patience. Lady Isabel stood near the marble chimney-piece, a figure arranged, though not artificially, to be looked at and looked back from. She was handsome in that complicated English way that allows for a handsome mind. Her hair, which she wore frankly white, had been coaxed into an arrangement that noted fashion and then did its duty to her bone structure. She had chosen a dress the color of a pale plum. On her wrist, a bracelet in which emeralds kept to themselves. Her manner was the old Alcazar trick. One spoke to her, and, after a moment's conversation, discovered that one had been examined, found all right for the present, and shelved gently, with a curious feeling of having been tidied. "The roses," she said now, as Sir Peregrine Vale approached her with the measured stride of a retired habit, "are by Miss Celia Harrow. You remember, Felix ardently pressed her on us at the Garrick dinner." Sir Peregrine offered his thin smile, the one that did not soften his eyes. "I recall a great deal of ardor and a surplus of opinion. Is Miss Harrow decorative or necessary?" He tilted his head to the arch of paper roses above the door. "The question proposes itself." "Let it," Lady Isabel said, "and then do fold it away in your pocket. Celia is young. That is not her fault." Sir Peregrine Vale had been a general, and wore his retirement, as he had worn his active service, with a sense of appropriateness. His coat was cut close to a good chest and narrow waist. He belonged to a generation that put its watch back into its pocket and did not look at it again until there was something to be caught. He had a daughter-in-law he disliked and an opinion about everything he hadn't tried. He found art, when it failed to arrange itself into categories, impertinent. "Miss Harrow will be flattered to have her roses adjudged culpable," he said. "Where is Felix?" "Quarantined in the bay window with the Frostham girls," Lady Isabel said. "They are bent upon the theatre. Felix is bent upon their father's subscription. I should like to alter the angle of one of them, but cannot decide which." The bay window was doing its social work. In it, Felix Arden, a director with a reputation for coaxing produce from actors and money from patrons, waved a long hand with 2 rings flashing a little. He was all precision and velvet, his enthusiasm folded for the moment into the neatness of his tie. Around him were the Frostham girls, tall and pale, who had been taught to listen with their chins level. With them stood Nigel Pentlow, a dealer in small moderns, who had a narrow face and a tie of battle colour. There were others. Dr. Hermione Quell, whose book on the aesthetics of imitation had been nearly given a prize. Judith Manx, Lady Isabel's secretary. a woman in whom efficiency had contrived to look like gentleness until one looked twice. The Honourable Audrey Lancing, Lady Isabel's niece, who was of the age when a certain helplessness is considered irresistible by people who prefer helplessness to any other quality in a girl. She wore dove grey and an expression that could be mistaken for docility at a distance. The creator of the paper roses stood slightly apart, as if in loyalty to her work she must not be too much seen among it. Celia Harrow had the look of someone who had, some time in the last 2 years, been very hungry and then very busy. She was dark, not theatrically so, with a level gaze and hands that tried not to move when she talked. The long table behind her had been arranged with small boxes, each containing a rose and a card with a name in a careful script: Auguste Moon, Madame Plantier, Souvenir de la Malmaison. If there was eccentricity, it was the affectionate sort. Lady Isabel observed the room and found it as she expected, the small alliances forming and dissolving, tiny eddies of attention created and slackened by the arrival of a person whose presence absolved others of the duty to say anything fresh. A modest piece for the cello was being coaxed out of the piano by a young man whose fate, to everyone but himself, was already clear. The smell of tea moved over the paper scent, which was faintly of starch and something like a cleaned drawer. "It's truthful," said Dr. Quell, appearing at Lady Isabel's elbow and regarding the roses. She spoke as if she were writing a footnote and did not wish to be accused of rashness. It avoids that false amiability that ruins most imitations. There is a certain necessary sadness in good mimicry. "I should have you speak to Celia," Lady Isabel said. "She is too proud to be improved, but she might be comforted." Dr. Quell's glance slid to Celia, then, swiftly, and as if the speed apologized, to Felix. Felix, catching the glance by instinct, smiled with trained warmth. It reached his eyes because he could do that when he liked. The Frostham girls saw the smile and rearranged their spines. Nigel Pentlow chose the exact moment to murmur something to Audrey Lancing. Audrey, who had been watching Celia, started so slightly that only Judith Manx, who had a talent for seeing small things and not speaking of them, made a mental note. "Is there a pin in these?" Sir Peregrine, who had stationed himself near Celia's table, had picked up a rose and turned it in his hand as if expecting it to confess. One hears extraordinary tales of female ingenuity. "There is a wire," Celia said. Her voice was clear, with a very small notch taken out of it, to keep the curve from telling lies. "Please take care." "Of course," Sir Peregrine said. He put the rose down with the exaggerated caution of a man being ironically obliging. "You have named them?" "I have," Celia said. "I confess myself in ignorance of the names of roses," Sir Peregrine said. "I've always thought it slightly absurd to bestow personality upon a flower." "Then the flowers will have to manage without Sir Peregrine," Felix said, joining them, his ring hand making a small orbit in the air, which, having observed them in various contexts, I fancy they will do. "Miss Harrow, you have been admired by the Quell. That is like being named in a will for virtue." Dr. Quell, who had come up behind, permitted herself the controlled expression that in others would have been amusement. "Mr. Arden teases. I observed that your roses are good. I am less certain about the display. The arch is a shade theatrical." "The arch is theatre's apology to botany," Felix said. "It is meant to show that we acknowledge nature's original production. We make no copy without gratitude." "One hopes," Nigel Pentlow murmured, "that gratitude will be reflected in the price." He looked at Lady Isabel with an expression that had raised funds for small sculptors and large emeriti. "We are for charity this afternoon," Lady Isabel said. "You must either endure it like a man or exploit it like a businessman. I beg you to do whichever you find less tiring." She turned to Audrey. "My dear, you look as if you were listening to something very distant and very improper." "I was listening to nothing at all," Audrey said, coloring slightly. She was 21 and had learned that colouring slightly was an asset if managed with thrift. "I was thinking of the roses." "Which?" Lady Isabel said. "That one," Audrey said, pointing delicately. Madame something." "Malmaison," Celia said. She looked at Audrey curiously, and then not at her at all. "It is like—" Audrey began, and stopped. Her eyes went again to Celia, rather quickly. Felix watched this with the little abstraction he allowed himself when a scene, however slight, could be of use later. He wondered where the thread ran. The room, which had been in a comfortable pitch of talk, shifted its weight. The piano faltered and recovered. Judith Manx, placing a plate of sandwiches by the low sofa, took the moment to retrieve an envelope from beneath the dish. She did it with the careful imprecision of people who do not wish to be seen retrieving a thing, and are therefore almost always seen. Miles Tether, the butler, entered with hot water for the tea, and with that silence which some men acquire as others acquire a degree. "Tether knows how the house breathes," Lady Isabel had once said to a guest who mistook him for furniture. "He adjusts it by degrees." He did so now. The windows were admitted a fraction of air from the wet street. The fire was encouraged by the addition of a single piece of wood. A draught that had troubled the paper arch settled and ceased to complain. Tether placed the hot water, removed the cooled, and paused, very slightly, before the bowl of white roses near the mantel. It was not a pause of concern. It may have been the sort of pause in which a thought decides not to pursue itself to its conclusion. "Miss Harrow," Lady Isabel said, "your varnish. What do you use?" "Gum arabic," Celia said, "with a little shellac. The papers take it differently. Some stiffen too eagerly." "It will be curious," Dr. Quell observed, "to see if the roses are as affecting at dusk. A maid thing has to choose its hour." "Like a debutante," Nigel Pentlow said, glancing again at Audrey. "Mr. Pentlow," Lady Isabel said, "is about to be sent to sit with Sir Peregrine. That will do both of them good." Sir Peregrine, who had found the paper knife on the side table, an old-fashioned thing with a leaf-shaped blade, was turning it over in his hand. It seemed to satisfy him in a way that the roses did not. He laid it down and then, as if unwillingly, picked it up again. He told himself he was looking for a letter. "I have some programs," Felix said. He produced from an inner pocket a sheaf of printed cards and one long envelope that was slightly out of keeping with the rest. "Our next production will be Leicester." "No," he amended, catching Lady Isabel's eye. "Something with fewer obvious opportunities for misunderstanding. May I? Miss Manx, I have one for you. You're in charge of diaries and therefore of history." Judith Manx took the envelope intended for her and placed it with others in a red leather portfolio that had a habit of appearing where it needed to be. Her fingers, slim and exact, were faintly stained with carmine. It was the sort of mark that might come from handling a rose too intimately. She closed the portfolio and slipped the key back on its chain. "What a conscientious person you are, Miss Manx," Nigel said, as if offering a compliment to someone who had earned it by not desiring it. "Do you ever allow yourself to be late?" "Only for things I'm unable to help," Judith said. She did not raise her eyes. If she had, she would have seen Audrey, who had moved, oddly, towards the door that led to the little staircase and the small private gallery above. Celia saw it. She looked once, quickly, at Lady Isabel, and then followed with the smoothness of a person accustomed to not disturbing a drawing-room when she leaves it. Felix, watching everything with affectionate acquisitiveness, turned his body to give his profile to the room and his attention to the door. He did not move. The Frostham girls, suddenly deserted, looked at one another and then at Dr. Quell. Sir Peregrine, with the paper knife, found the letter he had not been sent and opened it. He did not read. Miles Tether poured tea and observed a rigidly correct nothing. It is, perhaps, at such moments, in the slight interval between moderate amusements, that the tone of a gathering discloses itself. Lady Isabel, whose tone was firm, allowed the room to adjust without the false relief of calling Celia back. She moved a little, distributing her eye and her small sentences. Conversation resumed its even lay. Only Dr. Quell noticed that the little draught had returned, and that the arch of roses stirred with a shiver that was almost life. In the passage beyond, the carpet made a discreet complaint under 2 sets of feet. Audrey's quick step was followed by Celia's even one. The little staircase to the private gallery took turns too tight for skirts that wanted to be thought of. On the landing, a small table held a vase with 1 white paper rose, unvarnished, its edges raw. As Audrey reached it, she put out a hand as if to steady the flower, then seemed to recollect herself and withdrew. Celia, who had come up 2 steps and paused, said very gently, "Miss Lansing?" "Yes." Audrey did not turn. "I shouldn't touch. It marks." "I wasn't touching," Audrey said. "I was only— I don't know what I was." Celia waited. The quiet between them had texture. Downstairs, Sir Peregrine's voice made a decided comment about cucumber sandwiches, and a general laughter answered it with the precise warmth of a cultivated greenhouse. "It is pretty," Audrey said, after the quiet had gone on just long enough. "But not friendly." "Some are," Celia said. "The names help. I pretend to know them, and they pretend to be known." "You have to pretend," Audrey said. "I suppose," Celia said, "we do." She might have said more, but Judith Manx, light and correct, had come to the foot of the stairs and stood there, looking up with the patient seriousness she had for unscheduled events. "Lady Isabel asks whether Miss Harrow will be so kind as to explain to Mr. Pentlow why the roses cannot be delivered before Friday," she said, "and whether Miss Lansing will be so kind as to come down and talk to Dr. Quell about translation." It was very slightly the wrong thing. Audrey, who had been made of small wrong things for a year, responded in kind. She said, "Of course," and came down in a hurry that was not quite hurried. Celia followed more slowly. On the landing, she did what it is possible that Miles Tether had done before. She hesitated next to the single white rose, and then did nothing at all. Downstairs, the talk had lifted a fraction. It is often the fate of a small disturbance to make a larger smoothness to compensate. Lady Isabel received Audrey with a glance that one might have mistook for a caress. Felix offered Celia to Nigel Pentlow as a sort of living explanation of delay. Miles Tether, moving to the mantel, brushed with the corner of a cloth at a minute flake of varnish that had come to rest there. When he saw the carmine smear on Judith Manx's finger, he did not notice it at all. The rain began again, with the decency of rain that has been before and does not intend to astonish. The lamps in the street made small gold pools in which the passers-by could step without getting wet. In the drawing-room, the arch of paper roses quivered once, then resumed the exact posture Celia had given it. The party, rennet, presented itself to the evening as agreeable and well-behaved. Only Lady Isabel, who had the ghost of an anxiety that would not attach itself to any object, glanced towards the door to the little staircase and then away, allowing the anxiety to behave itself. She took a cup from Miles Tether and, as she sipped, saw Felix, with his careful warmth, introduce Audrey to Dr. Quell. She heard Sir Peregrine say something that would, later, make him embarrassed. She thought, without knowing why, of the single white rose on the landing, and of doing without the stiffness of shellac, however practical. The hour pressed and let go. The paper roses kept their counsel. If a crack had formed in the afternoon's calm, it was so slight as to be, in that well-run house, almost an impertinence. But a crack it was. It lay like a thin shadow on the varnish, and it would, in the ordinary course of London evenings, be asked for its meaning. Not now, not quite yet. The little exhibition ended as such things end, a domestic dispersal in evening clothes. Lady Honoria, with that spare hint of fatigue which made her seem more stately, allowed herself to be persuaded upstairs. The string trio folded its stands. The younger people, who had produced the tableau among the art and paper roses, congratulated one another with a touch too much gaiety. Coffee came in with trifling biscuits, and Mr. Henton withdrew with the noiseless efficiency that had outlived 2 earls and a war. The Rose Gallery, which was only the long conservatory, turned to Adrian Lyle's purposes, had been left half-lit for charm. Candles burned in glass sconces that threw small, well-behaved flames against the huge pale wreaths. The paper roses themselves were an extravagance, hundreds of them, pale as seashells and scored at the edges with the faintest of graphite grays, so that the whole avenue looked, in certain lights, like roses seen through rain. Among them ran, here and there, a thread of faintly scented vapor from Lyle's atomizers, his bow to realism. "It is not perfume," he had said earlier, with a faint, self-protective irony. "It is memory." Gideon Rakes, after his last courteous conflict with Lyle, had announced that he must telephone his driver. He had tucked his gloves of a supple yellow into the breast of his coat and carried his hat, an aggressively expensive fedora by the brim. He had not quite said good night to everyone. There were murmurings. Camilla Ashby watched him go with the deliberate innocence that pretty girls acquire for protection. "You'll squash them," she had said, and he had grinned at her, a tight, brief movement, as he lifted one of Lyle's paper blossoms from a plinth and rolled it between thumb and forefinger before setting it back, too hard, among its fellows. "Vulgarian," Dame Sybil said, not under her breath, and then repented with a glance at Lady Honoria's retreating back. Felix, his hands deep in his pockets, had made a little noise, half laugh, half something else. It was perhaps 20 minutes before Miss Livia Merrick, coming from the side passage with a letter Lady Honoria had forgotten to sign, thought of Rakes's gloves. She was of the sort of youth that is almost invisible in such company, neat and unadorned, and moved with a composure that had caught something of the house. The gloves were not in the cloakroom. She crossed the marble hall and turned into the Rose Gallery, intending to fetch them if they had been abandoned on a chair. The door yielded without sound. Inside, the candles made a polite dusk. The faint, distilled fragrance hung in the air. There was, too, a note that might have been from the furniture polish or from the petals treatment. Something almond at the edge of thought. The avenue of roses ran away from her, the pale heads bending as if under a breath. In the farthest chair, in a little recession contrived by Lyle for perspective, someone sat very still. "Mr. Rakes," Livia said, because it was the correct thing to say, and because all the forms persisted even in uncertainty. The figure did not move. She advanced, the grey silk of her skirt scarcely stirring. At 2 paces distance, she paused. Rake's head had fallen, slightly to one side. His hat rested on his knee. One hand hung over the chair arm. There was, under the candlelight, no dramatic contrast of color. His lips were parted, but as if he had started to speak and thought better of it. The eyes were open and had settled into that particular vacancy which, once seen, is recognized with an inward assent. The faint, sweet, bitter breath of the place seemed stronger about him. Livia stood very still. She was, one felt, an intelligent girl who understood that certain forms must now be observed in a different key. After a moment she went to the door and touched the bell. Mr. Henton answered it himself, which was unusual. "If you please, Mr. Henton," she said, and her voice was even, "in the Rose Gallery." He took in her face and went past her. He approached the chair, looked, and in the same movement reached for the switch that turned the fans off. The whispering of the petals ceased. "We will close the door, Miss Merrick," he said. His tone was very much what it had been 10 minutes before when he had spoken to the footman about the coffee. "And keep the company, if you please, in the blue drawing-room." "Is he—" Livia began. "Yes," said Henton. He did not look at her. "If you please." She went. The blue drawing-room held what remained of the party in a composition that would have pleased Lyle less than his paper roses. Dame Sybil had removed her gloves and was staring at her hands as if they had betrayed her. Felix's laughter, which had tried again, had failed and left him with a swallow that could not get down. Adrian Lyle stood with his back to the mantel, as if it were a stage picture and he the inconvenient center of it. "Mr. Raikes is unwell," Livia said. The room did not break, but something like a breath went through it. Henton entered, closed the door behind him with respect, and addressed himself to Lady Honoria's absence. "We shall require a doctor and the police," he said, to the company in general, who drew themselves up as if their spines had been touched with a cold instrument. "If I may suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that we remain here." No one spoke for a heartbeat. Then Colonel Brant said with military understatement, "Quite." Henton went to the telephone. The rhythm of the house, which had accommodated so many formalities, obliged the emergency to conform. He gave an address, a name, a short explanation without adjectives. When he replaced the receiver, he stood for a moment, listening to that absence of sound that is sometimes more explicit than noise. In the rose gallery, the paper roses, deprived of their mechanical breath, bowed their pale heads. Somewhere, beyond stairs and corridors, the great city went on with its night, indifferent. The correct inquiries had been set in motion. They would send someone from the yard. The house waited, as a good house will, and no one, quite, allowed themselves to look at Adrian Lyle. Allean, arriving without haste and with the air of a man who seldom had to declare himself, was shown through Lady Sybil Latchmere's hall by a butler whose steadiness might have been mistaken for indifference. Fox came behind, large and self-effacing. The house's calm, cultivated scent, wax, lilies, old bindings, gave way as Reeves conducted them to the conservatory, to the faint fug of paste and damp paper. "Inspector," Lady Sybil said, meeting them on the threshold. She had the poise of a portrait sitter and the tired tolerance of one who has kept a long pose in uncomfortable shoes. "Thank you for coming so promptly. We have done nothing, save to keep everyone together as you asked us on the telephone. The poor man is there." She inclined her head toward the pool among the paper roses. The installation had been contrived with whimsical extravagance. Dozens of pale flowers sprung from wire stems swaddled in satin ribbon, their petals hand-tinted in gradations of blush to ivory. They were reflected in a shallow black tray of water lined with lacquer. In its mirror lay the figure of Peregrine Blount, face turned, one hand swallowed by the roses, his spectacles folded neatly on the stone lip like a small decision. Allean neither bowed over the hand Lady Sybil did not offer, nor made more of his presence than to murmur, "You have been very sensible." He stepped past her with no more disturbance than a draught. The conservatory hummed quietly. A burner somewhere ticked. The warm damp, more theatrical than botanical, softened every edge. Allean stood a little distance from the pool and looked, first at the roses, then at the man among them, and, last, at the floor that led to the pool. The tiles showed a scatter of darkened footprints that had been dried to a fine bloom, as if the night had gently erased its own act. Only near the tray was their true wetness, splashing in blunt arcs that had not traveled far. Fox had already withdrawn to a respectful remove, notebook unopened. Reeves, completing his function by existing unobtrusively, watched the inspector without appearing to do so. "The doctor?" Allean asked, not for information. "In the morning room," Lady Sybil answered. "He happened to be here at the viewing. Dr. Vale. He would not say much. He thought the police should see." Her voice altered subtly, as if fatigue had found a kindness to rest upon. "Mr. Blount has been tiresome in print, but hardly deserving. This." Allean went down on his haunches, careful about where he put his hand against the stone. He gazed at Blount's face, which seemed oddly untroubled. The mouth was not grimaced. The eyes, beneath the wet lashes, were calm. This last quality taller than death and unlike it. The man had unbuttoned his cuff. A narrow ribbon of linen had darkened with water. On the exposed wrist, nothing more sinister than a faint bloom of violet sweetness. He said to Fox over his shoulder, "Lavender water." Fox sniffed, apologetic. "I wouldn't put it past this lot, sir." Allean repressed a smile. He studied the folded spectacles, their lenses clear of droplets, and then the paper rose that was ensnared in Blount's hand. The crumpled petal was smudged with a reddish finger mark that was not blood. He thought of grease paint, then of carmine pigment, then of the particular paste that paper artisans use, tinted to disguise its dullness under light. There was a glass atomizer on a nearby table, its bulb flattened. When he lifted it, it left a ring darker than its own weight would allow. He replaced it where it had been, and his eye flicked toward the side door. A rim of moisture, narrower than a finger, had been captured in the draught by the jam. "You missed the flowers," he said, still not looking at Lady Sybil. "Mr. Fenwick's assistant, Miss Maitland, does," Lady Sybil replied after a fraction too long. "They dry in this heat," he says, "and must look alive." "Ah." Allean turned. Through the glass, he could see a cluster of figures gathered in the gallery proper. The actress with the bee-sting mouth and perilously delicate shoulders. The financier who wore his success with the studied care of a portrait. The general who had survived, it seemed, everything except this party. The young woman, the niece perhaps, who had been laughing earlier in brittle little cascades and was now stitched with silence. Between them, not belonging to any group, stood Ludo Fenwick, the artist, thin and intent, his fingers stained as if he had been remembered by his materials. "Have you moved him?" Allean asked Reeves. "No, sir." "Nor those?" He indicated the spectacles. "No, sir." Allean nodded. "You have excellent habits." He straightened. The small creak of his knee sounded impertinent in the hush. He looked again at the wet arcs near the pool. Not much of a struggle, if any. The water was shallow, and Blount had been no child. One had to be very obliging to let one's face be held down unless one was unconscious, or unless the posture had been arranged afterward to suggest a melodrama, the scene itself rejected. He moved along the border of the installation, pausing at the table where the atomizer sat. Beside it lay a handkerchief, starched with an initial that had bled its thread dye into the damp. A V, vampiric in its little bleed. He did not touch it. "Shall we keep them where they are for the present?" Allean said, and Lady Sybil inclined her head. He observed that she had drawn no one into confidences. The social body of the party had been guided to a manageable room and fixed there with hospitality. She would have poured them tea if that would cage their agitation. There was, in her conduct, a fastidiousness that looked like virtue and might be strategy. "I'll speak to them by and by," Allean said. "Gently, so as not to trample if we can help it. Fox, perhaps we might have Dr. Vale." "And Miss Maitland?" Lady Sybil asked. "She is very young." "Then we shall be very kind," Allean said, and went back through the ribbon of heat into the house, carrying with him the soft knowledge that the roses had been misted more recently than their maker would require, that lavender had no part in a critic's toilette, and that folded spectacles at the scene of a drowning could be a mannerism, but more probably were a message. Allean stepped back from the studio with the measured reluctance of one leaving a chapel after a private service. He closed the door very gently and spoke to Little John in a low voice that did not carry. The room was to be left precisely as it had been found. Fox, with his unhurried thoroughness, marked the door and windows and made a list of those who had entered since the discovery. These practicalities, performed without bustle, settled over the household like a soft injunction to behave. "In the morning room, if you please," Allean said to Finch. "If you would be so good as to ask Mr. Ainsworth and Mrs. Gable to join us. We shall be no more than a few minutes with each person." Finch inclined his head. If grief had softened his mouth, habit had stiffened his spine. He moved with that particular quiet peculiar to old houses and old service. The morning room, with its chintz and garden view, seemed to have been designed to deny unwelcome realities. Allean stood for a moment by the long windows, reading the lawn and the clipped yews as if they might speak. A small breeze lifted the curtains and brought a scent from the borders. Late roses, the honest kind. Finch presented himself first. He remained standing until Allean indicated a chair, and then sat with care, folding his hands so that the knuckles made an architecture of restraint. "Your lady was in her studio last evening?" Allean asked, as if to confirm a familiar habit. "Yes, sir. Her ladyship kept to her work after dinner. It is customary. The objects were required for the church bazaar." Finch's glance flickered away from the word objects, as if he hesitated between the terms art and ornament. "Who dined with her?" "Mr. Hugo Ainsworth dined in, sir. Miss Dane took a tray in her room." "Miss Dane is—" "Her ladyship's secretary companion. She manages correspondence and such matters." "And after dinner?" "I took coffee into the drawing-room at 8. Her ladyship did not take it. She asked instead for tea in the studio at past. Jasmine." His face, which had been a study in the correct recital of routine, wavered very slightly. "It is not her ladyship's usual evening preference." "What is her usual preference?" "Cocoa, sir, or occasionally chamomile." "You took the tea up yourself?" "No, sir. Mrs. Gable attended. I saw the tray prepared. I placed the cup and pot upon it." Allean accepted this with a small nod and the shadow of a smile that might have been gratitude or encouragement. "You heard nothing in the night?" "Nothing, sir. The house slept very quiet." Allean dismissed him with thanks and sent a glance toward Fox, who had made a note of Jasmine. Hugo Ainsworth came in with a faint air of appearing at his own convenience. He was a well-made man in his 30s, one of those agreeable faces that seem to expect an ally across a dinner table. His black tie had been knotted with attention, as if correctness, once achieved, could stand in for emotion. He offered a quick hand and withdrew it at once, aware of its inappropriateness. "My aunt," he said, and let the sentence tail into the neutral territory, where statements are not invitations. Allean indicated the same chair. "You dined with Lady Clarissa?" "Yes. Quite a small affair. My aunt ate very little. We spoke of the bazaar. She wished to exhibit the roses as a sort of installation in the nave. She liked the idea of, well, surprise." "Did anything disturb her?" A faint color rose. "We differed about the matter of my going up to town next week. I have business." "In which she took an interest?" "She preferred me not to go at present. There are family matters, solicitors." He smiled, but his eyes had skated away before the smile could take hold. One does not bandy such things. "You left her after dinner?" "At 7:30. I had letters. I looked in again later and she was at her desk. She scarcely noticed me. Her tea had not yet come." Did she ever scent the flowers?" "Scent?" Hugo's surprise seemed genuine and a trifle amused. "No. She despised that sort of trick. She was stern about pretense." He stood suddenly. "If that is all, Inspector?" "For the moment." Allean's tone was easy. "You will not go up to town today." Hugo hesitated, then inclined his head in a manner that managed to be both obedient and resentful. Mrs. Gable followed him. Small, neat, the neatness of someone who knows it is expected of her. She perched on the edge of the chair and folded her hands in her lap as if she might keep them from speaking for her. "You took Lady Clarissa her tea," Allean said. "Yes, sir, at the half-hour. Mr. Finch told me Jasmine and I thought it odd, but I don't argue with instructions." "Why odd?" "Her ladyship, pardon me, didn't care for flower teas. Said they smelt like drawers." She glanced down, ashamed of the joke. She took it, though. "Leave it there, Gable," she said. She had a rose half made in her hand. "Did she remark anything else?" "No, sir." A pause. "Only, there was a smell, sir. Not the tea, and not the paste neither. Just a sort of—" She searched for a safe word and found none. "A sort of wrongness. In the room. Yes, sir, very faint. You did not mention this to Mr. Finch." "I know, sir. It wasn't my place to say. Not then." She lifted her eyes and met his with a careful courage that was both apology and defense. Allean let the silence sit between them until it became companionable. "When you found her this morning?" "I called her, as always. She didn't answer. I went in. I saw her hand on the little white rose, and I thought she'd dropped to sleep. I wasn't frightened at first. It was the quiet that did it. Thank you, Mrs. Gable." When she had gone, Fox turned his pencil end over in his fingers. "Jasmine's an odd fish," he said, almost to himself. "Odd, and therefore large in our small pond." Allean looked again toward the garden where honest roses opened without guile. Miss Dane next, and after that, the household ledger. He did not add that Finch had flinched almost imperceptibly at the mention of Jasmine, nor that Hugo Ainsworth had been too quick to dismiss the notion of scent. The observation settled, light as dust, awaiting the slightest breath to stir them into pattern. The housekeeper came with a quiet authority that suggested the house itself moved at her bidding. Mrs. Cattermole was square of shoulder, neat of dress, and moderate of voice. She seated herself on the edge of a chintz chair as if trespass were not to be encouraged, and folded her capable hands. "Mrs. Cattermole," Allean said, "you oversee the ordering of the house. I should be obliged if you would tell me of last evening." Her eyes, a mild grey, settled somewhere above his shoulder. "It was an ordinary night, sir. Dinner at 7:30. Mr. Julian dined in town, so we were 4 in the dining room. Her ladyship, Miss Iris, Mr. Meredith, her ladyship's cousin, and Miss Dacre. Miss Dacre, the secretary companion, sir. She comes and goes as needed, but her room is here." Allean inclined his head. "And after dinner, Lady Clarissa went to the studio, as she often did. Miss Iris practiced the piano for a while and then retired. Mr. Meredith had letters to write. Miss Dacre brought a tray to the morning room, notes for the charity committee. It was quite ordinary." She paused. "We keep to our routines." "Except for the jasmine," Allean said. A flicker of surprise crossed the composed face. "Mr. Finch told you?" "He did. Did you find the request unusual?" "She did not favor scented teas, sir, but we are not to question." There was a fractional hesitation. "Her ladyship did say she would not wish to be disturbed later." "A familiar instruction?" "On nights when she worked late, sir. She would have her paste and papers and a lamp. We knew to keep quiet in that wing." Mrs. Cattermole's gaze traveled, not quite involuntarily, toward the corridor as if it possessed a life of its own. Her door was shut, another thing, though she usually kept it a little on the latch in case of drafts. Last night it was closed? "Yes, sir." Allean let that be. "The letter she received. Did you see it?" "No, sir." The hands remained folded, but their grip altered minutely. "Her ladyship opened her post herself." "And Miss Dacre?" "She sorts the household correspondence. Her ladyship's personal letters she did not pry into." Mrs. Cattermole's tone made prying the most vulgar of sports. They released the housekeeper and asked for the secretary. Miss Dacre entered with that unobtrusive air, which is the highest professional attainment. She was 28 or thereabouts, plain in a careful way, with a clear, pleasant voice, and gloves which she did not remove. "You lodge here?" Allean asked. "Yes, Inspector." "You dined with Lady Clarissa last night?" "Yes." At his silence, she added, "There was nothing in her manner to alarm me. She discussed the committee, the November program, and Mr. Meredith's paper." her routine after dinner. She went directly to the studio. She was always very particular about the order of her tools. As she spoke, her gloved hands performed a little pantomime of arranging small things in a precise line. She became aware of it and checked herself. I wrote up the accounts in the morning room and then went to my room to copy a letter. A letter of her ladyship's? No. The denial came too quickly and was repaired. A circular, Inspector. For the Arts Circle. Miss Iris asked me to draft something. It was nothing. And the post. Was there anything unusual delivered yesterday? Miss Dacre's eyes, intelligent and guarded, did a small calculation and returned to him armed. The second post brought the usual. Catalogues, appeals. One hand I didn't recognize. A local envelope, cheap. I took it up with the others. Lady Clarissa read it and put it away. In her desk? I suppose so. She looked past Allean's shoulder, precisely as Mrs. Cattermole had done. I didn't pry. You wore gloves last night? Allean asked mildly. Yes. My hands chapped with papers. There was indeed a softness of ointment about her, and a faint, sweetish odor, glue perhaps, or paste from the studio. On her right glove, at the forefinger, a darker line suggested a cut beneath. Allean observed and said nothing. The chauffeur, Mr. Betts, came next, a compact, careful man whose cap seemed part of his skull. He stood with disciplined ease near the door. Any comings or goings after you put the car away, Mr. Betts? No, sir. Quiet as quiet. At what hour did you stable the car? 8:20, sir. You heard nothing then? No visitor's motor, no footsteps on the gravel? Betts's eyes did not move, but something in the set of his mouth suggested he was shifting weight on a truth. If there was a motor, sir, it didn't come to the front. Meaning? There's the side track down by the yews, Betts said, and then, as if regretting generosity, added hastily, Used by trade, sir, sometimes late. Last night? He weighed the silence and came down on loyalty. Couldn't say, sir. The young footman, Edwin, had the look of one who had been told repeatedly to speak when spoken to and to keep his notions to himself. He was pale with effort and rigid with the need not to err. You took up the Evening Post? Allean asked. Yes, sir. You noticed anything peculiar? No, sir. A swallow. Only. Allean waited. Only the door, sir. Her ladyship's. It was shut. Usually we kept it on the latch because of the draught from the passage, and there was a light under it very late. How late? Edwin glanced at the closed door through which he would presently pass back into the household. 11:30, sir. Maybe. Mr. Finch locked up after. I was putting out the hall lamps. Voices? Allean asked, as if proposing a remote possibility. Edwin's eyes skittered to Mr. Finch, who stood patient near the fireplace, a figure of reticence. Couldn't say, sir. Couldn't, Edwin. Finch's voice, low and immaculately neutral, inserted itself like the smooth closing of a drawer. Didn't, said Edwin, flushing, and withdrew into silence. Allean thanked them and allowed the atmosphere to resume its carefully polished finish. He sat by the long windows a while and let the household resume its pace around him. The house, obedient, moved on its rails. Routines showed their edges in this light. The clock wound, the lamps snuffed, the door customarily on the latch, and last night not. Somewhere in the measured turning of that machinery, a small foreign thing had lodged and set it subtly out of tune. He could feel it in the careful evasions of Miss Dacre, in Mr. Betts's loyalty that made a hedge of the side track, in Mrs. Cattermole's phrase, "We keep to our routines." He rose at last. "Fox," he said, "we shall have the desk, if you please, and perhaps Mr. Finch will oblige us with the keys he holds for her ladyship's private things." Finch inclined his head. "There is only the one, sir, and her ladyship kept it by her." A pause for propriety. "She had her places." "Yes," said Allean, looking beyond the morning room to where, in the cool studio, paper roses stood without their maker. I fancy she did. He did not yet put a hand to anything. That would come. For the present, he let the knowledge of the house pass over him like a breath held too long, and felt, like the settling of very fine dust, the presence of a clue concealed in the ordinary, waiting not to be seized, but to be recognized. Allean returned to the studio when the light had thinned to that colorless hour which flatters neither paint nor paper. He stood a while, just inside the door as before, and let the room present itself again. The immaculate ranks of cutting tools, the orderly drift of petals upon trays, the small domestic dignity of the spirit lamp beside the paste. It was a workroom understood by habit. He had found that people who worked with their hands seldom lied to themselves about arrangement, and that where routine was law, anomaly could look like innocence until it was noticed. With gloved fingers, he eased open a shallow drawer in the work table and glanced at its contents. A ledger lay there, narrow, bound in faded calf, and beside it a pencil sharpened to an unforgiving point. He lifted the ledger and laid it on the desk, where the bone folder sat at its appointed right-hand corner, aligned like a ruler on parade. Mrs. Gable, summoned with a quiet word, stood within the threshold, politeness and reluctance folding her as tightly as her apron. Lady Clarissa kept a register, Allean asked, not looking up. She did, sir, for every piece she finished, a little number in the book and a mark on the underside of the base, if it pleased her to keep it. Ah. He turned the pages. There were dates, neat and spare, with entries that ran, no, 24/17, tea rose, apricot. No, 24/18, wild briar, blush. Then a small space, and below it, yesterday's date unaccompanied by any number or description. The line had been begun and abandoned, the pencil faintly pressing where it had hesitated. Missed her note last night, Mrs. Gable said softly. Never known her to. Allean closed the ledger on his finger and reached for the crushed white rose lying where it had been found under Lady Clarissa's left hand. He lifted it into the widening pool of window light. The spiral of petals was flawless in conception, but he saw, as a pianist hears a wrong note, that the cut of the outer petals took a leftward bias. He turned the little flower over. Its base was smooth and unmarked. No tiny figure in pencil, no trace of the fine orris powder Mrs. Gable had mentioned in passing when she told him of the routine of tidying, an indulgence of Lady Clarissa's that imparted, she had said, a proper clean sweetness to finished work. Lady Clarissa was right-handed, he asked. Yes, sir, very particular with it, and she dusted the orris with a soft brush, never her fingers. Yet here, he said, still examining the rose, there is neither figure nor powder, and the cut suggests a left hand. Mrs. Gable's hands trembled against her apron. Then she stopped herself and pressed her lips together. Begging pardon, sir. Allean returned the flower to the desk, not precisely where it had been, but a fraction to the right, as if to admit he had touched it. It may mean nothing, he said, and knew they both understood that in such rooms very little meant nothing. He asked for Finch, and when the butler arrived, the three of them stood, a little semicircle before the window that looked to the west. Its catch was good, well oiled. Allean tried it gently, and felt at once the confidence of a thing always managed by the same hand. He looked down at the sill. There was the faintest line, an arc of fine dust disturbed and then resettled, and in the groove a smear that felt greasy when he touched it through the glove. "Mr. Finch," he said, "yesterday morning when you closed this window, did you notice any scent from the garden?" Finch considered. "Not especially, sir. The roses have near gone with the weather. There is jasmine along the old stone, but it's on the south wall, not this one." "Still," Allean said, "the air moves about." He lifted the sash an inch. A thread of colder air crept in, and with it, distantly, a breath that was not the gentle ghost of a summer hedge, but something more deliberate. The faint, acrid undertone that had hovered just beyond his grasp thickened by the slightest degree. He lowered the sash and let the room close about them again. "Lady Clarissa's evening trays," he went on. "How are they managed?" Finch described the procedure with the exactness of a liturgy. The pot scalded, the measured spoonfuls, the warming of the cup, the silver strainer, the spoon placed bowl down upon the saucer to the right. "Her ladyship," he added, "would never abide a spoon left upright like a spade in soil." Allean's gaze moved to the bone china cup sealed away among Fox's careful exhibits. "And last night," Mrs. Gable answered, eyes lowered, "when I carried the tray down again, the spoon was on the saucer, bowl up. I meant to change it, but there was the smell and my wits ran." "Of course," Allean said. He slipped the ledger back into its drawer and paused. To the left of it lay a small, pale blue wafer of sealing paper. Another lay beneath, and beneath that, nothing. "Did Lady Clarissa seal her letters?" he asked. "Not as a rule," Finch replied. "She preferred her envelopes gum, except for little notes to herself, which she kept closed against untidy curiosity." "And yesterday afternoon?" Allean asked without emphasis. Finch's eyes flickered, not in guilt, but in loyal caution. "She sealed the letter she wrote after receiving the other one, sir." "The other?" "The one from the local post, sir. The one that put her into a state." Finch's tone was impersonal, his gaze fixed upon a neutral middle distance. "She wrote a reply and sealed it. But when I came to clear her desk this morning, there was no reply to send." Mrs. Gable, who had been silent, murmured, "There's always the smallest smutch of gum on the blotter when she works those wafers. I wipe it after." "There wasn't any smutch, sir." "Not last night." She looked anxious at having said too much. Allean inclined his head. "Thank you." He did not say that a letter she had sealed might have been opened again by someone who did not believe in tidy curiosities, or that a rose without powder made by a left hand might not be a rose at all, but a sign placed with a steady composure he almost admired. He asked Fox, when they were again alone, to have a quiet word in the village about the nephew's doings and to learn discreetly whether any of the shops had sold jasmine tea within the week. "And if," he added, "anyone, anywhere, keeps left-handed scissors." Fox gave him a look. "Left-handed mischief, sir?" "Not necessarily," Allean said. "Only a habit showing itself in a place where habits speak louder than words." He stood a moment longer by the west window, listening to the house. It had the tranquility of a drawing finished to the last delicate line. Yet he thought he heard, beneath that neatness, the dry whisper of paper being turned somewhere not far off. Evening gathered over the rose garden with a gentleness that felt almost contrived, as though the day were intent upon ending without remark. Allean and Fox took the gravel path that ran beneath the studio windows. The beds, stripped now of most of their autumn bloom, held a faint sweetness when the air moved. From the open west window, open no more than an inch, as Finch had described, there drifted the almost imperceptible remainder of that curious scent. It dissipated with the smallest breeze and returned when the air stilled, like a thought one cannot quite place. Fox stooped suddenly. "Here, sir," he said in his quiet way, and pointed to the base of a standard rose. A shred of white had caught on a thorn. Allean knelt and considered it. It was not a petal. It was paper, thin, torn along a manufactured line and bearing the faintest impression of a crease. He did not touch it at once. The thorn had pierced it lightly without tearing, as if the paper had brushed by rather than been pressed against it. A draught from the window might have carried it, Fox suggested. "Perhaps," said Allean. He watched how the leaf above quivered and how, in that movement, the paper made a whisper of sound against the thorn. He took out his handkerchief and, with a care that seemed to Fox almost ceremonial, lifted the scrap free. Not one of hers, he murmured. It had the same smooth surface and different weight as the rose he had examined in the studio. They were returning by the flagged path when the sound of a motor approached along the beach drive. It did not hurry. It came with a subdued discretion that perfectly suited the house. Finch, appearing with that uncanny butler's prescience, had already reached the front steps when a young man in town tweeds, very well cut, descended from the motor. He had a pleasant face that might have been stronger for being less agreeable, and he removed his hat with a show of respect one gives to a familiar ritual rather than to a particular person. "Mr. Finch Hatton?" Allean asked. "Yes," said the young man, with a glance that took in Allean's unobtrusive authority. "You are Inspector Alleyn. May I express my regret?" Alistair Finch Hatton lowered his gaze for a moment with what might have been real feeling or a neat reproduction of it. "I came at once. I had a note from my aunt this afternoon. Forwarded from my rooms in town, it seemed." His composure tightened almost imperceptibly. "It seemed urgent." "In your aunt's hand?" Allean asked, leading him into the cool restraint of the hall. "I believe so." He reached into his pocketbook and produced a single sheet. "It asked me to come down quietly, not to telephone, and to bring with me the little tin box from the escritoire at my flat, which of course I no longer have, having given it to her last year." It was odd. He watched Allean. "Also, it instructed me, if she were not in her studio, to leave a note with Mr. Finch and to, this is the phrase, do what we spoke of with the white rose." Fox, at Allean's elbow, glanced down without expression. Allean took the letter between two fingers and laid it upon a console table as if it were a fragile exhibit. "You've kept the envelope?" "No, I fear I was careless. The porter said it came by village post, redirected from town." Alistair looked almost boyish in his rueful elegance. "It can't have been written yesterday afternoon." "Not by your aunt," Allean said. He did not elaborate. The paper told him as much as the hand. The same foreign smoothness, a faint smell that had no business attaching itself to stationery, and, in the loops and cross-strokes, the disciplined hesitations of an imitator who knows the shape of a signature, but not its rhythm. Finch, who had watched this exchange with the respectful opacity of his kind, made a discreet cough that in another man might have been a clearing of the conscience. "If I may, sir," he said to Allean, "there is a small matter. Miss Vale has not returned." "Miss Vale?" Alistair turned sharply. "Isabel. She was to have shown—" He caught himself. "Miss Isabel Vale," Finch intoned, "has been working with her ladyship for some months, sir, in an artistic capacity." He looked at Allean. "She has rooms over the old gardener's cottage. She left a note with Mrs. Hartwell late this afternoon to say she was dining in the village. She has not done so before." Fox made a neutral sound that might have signified interest. "Bicycle missing?" "Yes, Mr. Fox, and a small leather case she uses for her papers is not in her rooms." Finch drew in the outline of his discretion. "Miss Vale is left-handed." Alistair's pleasant face closed for a moment, and then opened again with an almost practiced candor. "Isabel is highly strung, Inspector. She is quite incapable of anything you might imagine." "I imagine very little," Allean said amiably. "I prefer to observe." There came then a soft tap at the hall door. The village postmistress, Miss Raxworthy, stood there in a rain-speckled coat, apologetic, round-faced, and duty's emissary. Finch, with proper reluctance, admitted her. "I wouldn't intrude, Mr. Finch," she began, bobbing to Allean when he was named, "but there's a small irregularity, as one might say. I've brought the redirected post for the house, and there was a letter this morning, sir. Sent to Mr. Finch Hatton at his London rooms in Lady Clarissa's hand, as we all supposed, and delivered to me late last night for the early collection. Only it wasn't put through the box proper. It was given into my hand at 10:15 in the lane by the west gate." "By whom?" Allean asked, very gently. "A young lady, sir, in a dark coat and a blue scarf. She spoke softly." I thought it might have been one of the ladies from the house. I beg your pardon if I've erred." "You have done nothing of the sort," Allean said. "Thank you, Miss Raxworthy. You are most helpful." He did not look at Alistair, who had coloured faintly. When she had gone, he turned to Finch. "Is any member of the household indisposed?" "Miss Lydia Crane, sir, Lady Clarissa's cousin, has retired with a headache. She requests that she may be excused until the morning." "Of course," Allean said. Fox, who had been watching the letter on the console as if it might speak, said mildly, "There's a fashion for blue scarves in the village, sir." "There is a fashion for the wrong paper," Allean returned. He folded the scrap from the rose thorn into his handkerchief with the same, almost ceremonial care he had used before. "The studio is still sealed?" he asked Finch. "Yes, sir." "Then let it remain so. Mr. Finch Hatton, if you please, I should like a word with you in the library. Mr. Fox, perhaps you would be kind enough to ask Mrs. Hartwell to keep an eye upon the west gate, not to alarm anyone, simply to notice." It was, in all its components, a quiet upheaval. A letter that should not exist, a young woman absent when she should be accounted for, a cousin removed behind the screen of a headache, a scrap of paper that did not belong. They would have amounted to nothing in another place. Here, beneath the formal courtesies of Ainsworth Manor, they made a pattern that the evening gathered to itself and held. Allean, with the letter before him and the scent withdrawing again into the edges of the air, allowed the pieces to drift in his mind without forcing their arrangement. The truth, he knew, could be hurried into error. Better to let it settle as the garden settled into its proper shape. By evening, the house had adjusted itself into that particular quiet that follows disturbance, the furniture seeming to resume its accustomed poses, the rugs lying as they always had, the clocks resuming their indifferent duties. Allean, who had a musician's tolerance for rest as well as sound, let the silence do some of his work. He took his notes into the library, a room that believed itself a sanctuary and had the lighting to prove it. The shaded lamps cast a gentle cone over polished leather and foxed spines. Fox, content to be useful in a way that appeared casual, saw to the practicalities and then left him to his thoughts. He read his own handwriting with a kind of detached scrutiny. Jasmine, which Lady Clarissa found absurd. A letter that disturbed, now gone. A visitor heard at dinner, yet a tray left untouched. A window, usually shut, opened by habit. A rose fashioned by a left hand from foreign paper. Each line was small and almost decorous by itself. Together they formed a pressure in the air, as if some closed room in the house had been opened too suddenly. He moved to the French windows and drew the curtain a little aside. The rose garden lay in a disciplined geometry, the dark earth cut with pale paths, the plants themselves pruned to winter's severity. A woman moving there in a dark coat would appear and vanish between the boxed yews like a figure in a lantern slide. He could imagine the habit of it. A particular night, a particular hour, the west window opened just enough, a scent released like a signal, the deft left-handed hand that folded a message into a rose. It would have suited Lady Clarissa's mind, precise, ritualized, to allow an intrusion that masqueraded as order. He could imagine her acquiescence to something she believed she controlled, and how that certainty could be used against her. The servant's silence arranged itself as carefully as the papers in her drawers. Mrs. Gable had told him precisely what she could bear to tell. The cook, out of conscience or habit, had given him more. Finch's discretion was a garment cut to last a lifetime, and it did. Yet even Finch had permitted himself a thread or two. They were not concealing a vulgar scandal. The house had no appetite for those. They were protecting a particular construction of Lady Clarissa, exacting, principled, perhaps severe, but in some private way vulnerable. He could feel their wish that she should not be found to have been afraid. The nephew had not, Allean thought, lied. He had arranged his truths to be tolerable. There had been sincerity in the unease about the letter, and a shadow of something less comfortable in his mention of the woman in the garden. He dressed well enough, Alistair Finch Hatton, but the care showed. Soles too recently renewed, a cuff turned with thrift's exactitude. If money was a pressure, it operated not as panic in him, but as a steady weight. Such weights altered posture. They did not always produce crime. They often produced foolishness. He leafed idly through the books nearest to hand. Here were minor monographs on paper arts, tasteful catalogues of exhibitions, a slender volume inscribed on the flyleaf in a strong, curiously angular hand. To CA for the discipline behind every grace. It was unsigned. He replaced it where it belonged. Grace set upon. Discipline. The phrase would have pleased Lady Clarissa. It also described the temper of someone capable of duplicating her work almost perfectly and choosing not to. He considered the smell, not lavender, which the desk sachet wore like a polite apology. Something floral with an edge. Jasmine could serve as perfume or as camouflage. But if a thing is used as a signal, it must be recognized by both parties. The change from cocoa to jasmine suggested a concession on Lady Clarissa's part, either to the visitor's preference or to a prearranged sign. Such concessions, once allowed, tend to repeat. Finch's observation about the window was not a single lapse. It had the wear of habit. He put down his notes and let the question stop talking. When he did so, what remained was not a reconstructed mechanism, but a disposition of minds. A teacher and a pupil suffuse their work with themselves. If there had been a grievance about originality, it would have been personal, almost filial. In such matters, the gravest injury is not theft, but disavowal. One might force a reconciliation into the shape of ritual. A letter on dear paper, a meeting at an accustomed hour, a token rose made by the other hand. That token had been crushed under Lady Clarissa's own. Acceptance, rejection, or the last act of order asserted at the instant of defeat. He rang quietly. Fox appeared with the look of a man who has been thinking along simpler but sturdier lines and is willing to abandon them when asked. "Fox, we shall go to Miss Hartwell in the morning. Before that, I want a very discreet word with the chemist in the village about recent purchases. Jasmine, essences, anything of that kind. And ask Little John to let the studio alone tonight. No zeal. We'll post a man in the shrubbery near the west side. Not too near. If a habit exists, it may persist one more night." Fox nodded. "Very good, sir." And Fox, if Mr. Finch Hatton dines here, notice which hand he uses for his glass and how he lights his cigarette. If he smokes, no fuss. Right you are, sir. When he was alone again, Allean turned down the lamp and stood for a moment by the window. The garden was a composition now, flat and silvery under the moon's indifferent eye. In rooms such as these, people often mistook reserve for safety. The era was old and courteous, and very English. It could be fatal when someone clever enough to speak the dialect of restraint wished to commit a crime without noise. Tomorrow would require conversation, not accusation. He felt the impulse, always a warning to order events too soon. He let it pass. The dust would settle. In the settled dust, the shape would show. He drew the curtains fully and, with that final domestic act, set the stage for morning. Morning broke with a pale civility that seemed to apologize for the night's quiet industry. Fox presented himself at breakfast with his usual unobtrusive efficiency and 2 items of information folded into his manner. "The chemist, sir," he said, setting down a discreet memoranda. "Sells a small line of perfumed waters and essences. Jasmine among them. He recalls 2 purchases this week. One on Tuesday, a village lady, name unknown, for a sachet experiment, as he put it. The other yesterday, midday, a single dram of jasmine absolute and, curiously, a bottle of lavender water. Paid cash. He thinks the second buyer was not from the village. Neat hands, he noted. Ink on the right middle finger. Allean inclined his head. And our man in the shrubbery? Nothing conclusive. A faint movement at the west window a little after 11, raised and lowered by a cautious hand. No one approached from outside. The house was asleep by all appearances. Not quite, said Allean mildly. The house never quite sleeps. The visit to Miss Diana Hartwell's cottage took them by the lanes where hedges were still glistening from a light mist. Her dwelling, whitewashed, modest, and clean, stood slightly apart from the village proper and bore that air of self-possession that attaches itself to those who require from life only a small space of their own. Miss Hartwell herself received them with correct composure. She was a woman in her late 30s or a little more, with an unadorned face, steady eyes, and a figure formed by work rather than leisure. She wore a dark skirt and a cardigan that had been darned with extraordinary neatness. One noticed her hands at once. The fingers were narrowly made and stained at the tips with the fugitive marks of adhesives and paper dust. When she stood aside to admit them, she did so with an economy of gesture that suggested long practice in making room without spectacle. "I've heard," she said, and her voice, though clear, had that touch of huskiness that follows a wakeful night. "It is very sad. Will you come through? My workroom is tidier than the sitting room." The workroom was a small sanctum of order and purpose. Papers lay in sheaves, sorted by weight and tone. Tools, each with its own hook or dish. Jars labeled in a neat, angular hand. There was no scent of coquetry here. Rather, a faint, concentrated smell of gum, starch, and fresh paper. If jasmine had ever visited, it did not linger now. "It is kind of you," Allean said. "We shall not detain you unnecessarily." "I doubt you will," she answered, and there was the mildest glint of irony, quickly withdrawn. He did not at once mention Lady Clarissa. Instead, he moved as though admiring the rigor of the place, which was in its way a compliment. "You favor a smooth white stock," he observed. "Unwatermarked?" "For certain pieces, yes. It takes a score cleanly." She reached, left-handed, Allean noted without emphasis, for a small knife with a mother-of-pearl handle, and replaced it with that care which is less habit than reflex. "I also use a textured ivory when the fold asks for it. But you have not come to discuss paper, Inspector." "Not exclusively." He allowed a pause, in which polite conversation might either flower or fail. "Miss Hartwell, it seems Lady Clarissa received a letter on the afternoon before her death. It disturbed her." "I dare say." She looked at him full, her expression calm. "I wrote to her." "Ah." "I wrote on Monday," she continued, "and I sent it by village post. It would have been delivered Tuesday or Wednesday. I asked that she acknowledge certain matters. Old ones." She glanced down at her cutting board. "It will sound peevish to you." "It will sound to me as you wish it to sound," Allean said. Did she answer? No. The single syllable was without ornament. She seldom answered. There were times, years ago, when it seemed to amuse her to leave one suspended over a point of honor. "You resented this?" "I remembered it," said Miss Hartwell. He sat at her gesture on a wooden chair that had been carefully polished by use. "Were you in the Ainsworth Rose Garden on Wednesday afternoon?" "Yes." There was no flourish in the admission, no drama. "I walked there. A public footpath skirts the lower beds. It was not trespass." She considered. "I thought perhaps to meet Lady Clarissa under neutral hedges, as it were, but I did not approach the house." "You saw no one?" "I saw Mr. Finch Hatton at a distance, stroking his hat brim as though it might fly off of its own accord." I turned back. "On Thursday evening?" "No," she said. "I was here." She lifted her left hand to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Adhesive had dried in a pale film at the edge of the nail. "I worked late." Allean let the quiet gather. He found that in such silences, character presented itself more clearly than under any number of searchable questions. On a shelf near the window, a small blue bottle bore a discreet paper label in that same angular hand. Lavender. Beside it another, is smaller, darker, unlabeled. Your materials are exact, Miss Hartwell. They must be. Were you fond of Lady Clarissa? She gave the smallest smile. I loved what she could do with paper. I cannot say I loved the rest. And yet you learned a great deal from her. More than I admitted at the time, she said quietly, and more than she admitted at any time. There was, suddenly, a softness in her face that had not been there before, a recognition that debts and injuries sometimes form, over years, a single plaited cord impossible to unpick into separate strands. Allean let it stand. Your letter, he said at last. Would you by chance have kept a draft? I write plainly, Inspector. Drafts are for people who speak prettily to themselves. She hesitated. I did copy out a phrase that pleased me. Not because it was pretty, but because it was accurate. I keep it only to remind myself not to be mealy-mouthed. She crossed to a narrow desk, opened a drawer, and produced a slip of paper. He recognized the angular script. People mistake silence for weakness, it read. In time, they learn it is a decision. Allean looked up. Lady Clarissa used that thought. Almost the same words, the day your nephew by marriage called, he said, curious to hear it echo. Not curious, Inspector. I expect she recognized herself in it. Miss Hartwell's eyes were steady. You are free to take that copy. The original is gone? Quite gone, he said. Of course. He rose. We are grateful for your candor. You are not yet grateful, she returned, but without heat. You're only collecting. I know how these things go. At the door he said in a tone almost conversational, One more small matter, Miss Hartwell. Do you prefer jasmine? She appeared to consider the question for what it was, and for what it might be. As a scent, she said at last. It is too forward. It insists on being noticed. Thank you, said Allean. Back in the lane, Fox let out the breath he had not meant to hold. Left-handed, he said, as if the words were a personal admission. Yes, Allean agreed. And exact. Do we move at once? No, said Allean, watching a drift of cloud thin itself across a pale sun. We keep our collective calm. There is something in the house we have not yet asked, and when we ask it, we must be perfectly certain of the answer. The day held itself in poise, as if waiting for a note yet to be played. In the hedgerows, the last roses turned their paper-thin faces toward a light they did not require. Shortly after 11, Allean asked that Mr. Finch join him in the library. The lamps were shaded. The day held itself at a respectful distance beyond the long windows. Finch came in with that unexceptionable composure which, Allean had already learned, could be trusted to mask but not to falsify. Mr. Finch, Allean said, I shall be plain. A letter received by Lady Clarissa on Thursday afternoon has been removed from her desk. It was you who took it. There was no start, only the briefest stilling of the butler's hands upon the chair back. Yes, sir. Why? To spare the household avoidable distress. Finch's voice remained steady. It was from Miss Hartwell. It spoke of past grievances in terms that, pardon me, sir, would have furnished a ready scandal to those with a taste for it. Her ladyship had laid the letter aside with a look I had not seen upon her face before. I believed, perhaps wrongly, that it should not lie abroad for idle tongues. Allean inclined his head. And yet you tell me now, because I misjudge the nature of what we face. Finch lifted his eyes, grey and candid. There are loyalties, Inspector, that are better served by truth. Allean let this stand. One more matter. On Thursday evening, the west corridor and the studio. You heard voices. Finch's pause acknowledged capitulation. I did, sir, shortly before 10. I had gone up to assure the fastenings. When I passed the studio, I heard her ladyship speaking low and a gentleman answering. I would have moved on. One does. But I recognized Mr. Alistair's tone. His hands adjusted the back of the chair as if to steady it. I said nothing. To me it was a family affair. The window of the studio stood a fraction open. Later, when I returned, it was wider. I closed it. Allean considered him with quiet appraisal. Thank you. When they assembled in the morning room, Fox unobtrusive by the fireplace, Mrs. Gable summoned and white with dignity, Mr. Finch behind his mistress's chair by long habit, and Alistair Finch Hatton a little apart by the mantel. It had about it less of a conclave than of a gathering for the arrangement of a matter distasteful to all present. Allean took no central position. He seated himself near the windows where the garden showed its bare structure beyond the glass. I shall speak as simply as I can, he said. Lady Clarissa died in circumstances outwardly serene. The serenity was contrived. Alistair's eyes flickered and steadied. He kept his hands upon the marble as if to cool them. There was tea at 9:30, jasmine where cocoa had been a ritual. Allean went on. There were voices in the studio shortly before 10. There was a window, long kept shut, opened on Thursday evening, as it had been, deliberately and briefly, on the previous morning. There was a paper rose crushed under her hand, well made, but not of her stock and not of her hand. It bore the bias of a left-handed cutter, but not Miss Hartwell's particular bias. I had the advantage this morning of examining her work. The difference is minute yet characteristic. All this suggests an intrusion disposed with knowledge of the household's habits and of Miss Hartwell's history. Diana's name was not otherwise spoken. The suggestion sufficed and passed. Miss Hartwell wrote to Lady Clarissa, Allean continued, and the letter disturbed her. It has been removed, not by the hand that killed, but by a servant who mistook discretion for safety. Of the tea, I shall only say that we shall learn in due time precisely what it contained. I do not think it will surprise us. He let the quiet take the measure of his words. The clock on the mantel completed a delicate cadence before he resumed. Mr. Finch Hatton, you came to the house on Wednesday unexpectedly. You were seen again, though not admitted formally, on Thursday night. You knew your aunt's routines. You knew her studio, her aversion to drafts, the hour at which Mrs. Gable would go off duty. You knew, too, of Miss Hartwell's letter and of the old quarrel to which it alluded. It required a certain ingenuity to make use of that quarrel. Alistair did not move. Only the faint whitening of the knuckles upon the mantel betrayed strain. A left-handed rose, cut in foreign paper, is a neat device, Allean said, his voice almost meditative. Too neat. It points, but it does not persuade. Your aunt's own roses, even crushed, bear the inner scoring of a right-handed worker. Miss Hartwell's bear a sharper countercurve. The one we found in the studio bears neither. It was fashioned by a right-handed cutter affecting a left-handed bias. That affectation betrays purpose. Fox stirred, then was still. As for the window, Allean went on, we posted a man last night. No one came. There was no need. The signal had served its purpose on Thursday, a discreet admission from the path. Quiet, unobserved. It is a contrivance old houses too easily afford. He turned at last to Alistair. If there is anything you wish to say it now. I have no desire to force you. But I should like, for Lady Clarissa's sake, to give truth the gentleness owed to it. Alistair's fingers left the mantle, and he looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. When he spoke, it was to the room rather than to Allean. I wanted time, he said. Only time. She had decided. She meant to alter things. She said as much to me on Wednesday. There was a way if she would only allow it. But she was so certain, so very certain. No one moved. Finch's eyes were closed, as if at prayer. I thought, if it seemed to be Diana, there would be an inquiry, delays, talk. We could arrange matters quietly. I believed it would be quick for her. I believed—" He stopped, and the air in the room recalibrated to the absence of words. Allean did not advance. He merely inclined his head, as if to a confidant who had fulfilled an unhappy duty. "You will come with us presently," he said with the old courtesy that made command a kindness. "There will be formalities. Mr. Finch, if you will be so good as to send for the car." Mrs. Gable, with that particular dignity that service sometimes bestows at the last, rose and set the tea things in order as if for guests who had finally taken their leave. In the settled quiet that followed, the house seemed to recognize the shape of its loss and to accept, with something like relief, the cessation of elaborate evasion. Outside, the bare rose canes traced their black script against a sky the color of paper. Fox moved toward the door, then paused, waiting on Allean's slight nod. There would be time yet for the paperwork and the pity. For now, the truth had been said as gently as truth permits. Morning in the Ainsworth Valley arrived with a pale lucidity, as if the night had rinsed all color to a single quiet tone. The house seemed lighter for having shed something it had been laboring to conceal. Doors opened without the faint percussion of hesitation. Footsteps found their paths without that soft, listening pause at thresholds. In the blue saloon, where last evening Allean had unfolded his delicate case like a map drawn without flourish, Alistair Finch Hatton sat composed and rather handsome in defeat. He had slept nowhere, so far as one could tell. He wore the same carefully brushed suit with its slightly shiny elbows, and he had shaved. These small attentions, which had always distinguished him, clung to him now like a last defense. Fox stood a little behind, broad and capable, with that very gentle gravity he brought to such mornings. Finch had chosen to stand by the chimney-piece, hands correctly disposed, a figure of household loyalty distilled to its essence. Mrs. Gable wept, but softly, as if even tears must be respectful in their sound. "There need be no unpleasantness," Allean had said at the conclusion of the previous evening's recital. His voice remained as civil as any host's. "If you will come quietly with us, Mr. Finch Hatton." "I shall, of course," Alistair had replied, his eyes lowered to the pattern in the carpet as if it were a paragraph he must master. "There is no use in display." This morning it was only the practical matter of going. Finch, his voice carefully even, asked if Mr. Finch Hatton might first take a cup of coffee. Alistair declined. He rose, adjusted his cuffs, and met the eyes of no one at all. It is not the function of a drawing-room to echo, yet in that room a species of echo persisted, the echo of the quiet points made last night with such meticulous courtesy, the crushed white rose that was not of Lady Clarissa's paper, the left-handed cuts that bore, beneath their curves, the faint betrayals of a right-handed pressure, little scoring marks where the hand that imitated had hesitated before convincing itself. The window opened, not for draughts. Lady Clarissa feared them, but for a signal and a stealthy departure. The jasmine that was never her evening habit, used not as taste but as veil, and beneath its insistence, something more acrid had done its work. And the chemist's detail, Allean had said, making no more of it than good manners allowed. Ink on the right middle finger, which our friend assumed indicated left-handed writing. In my experience, Mr. Finch Hatton, it more often indicates a right-handed pen, cheap ink, and an anxious grip. You see, even your care with the small things has been a little too careful. There had been no outburst. Alistair had looked for a moment almost relieved. "It was never a matter of hatred, Inspector," he had said at last, low and perfectly distinct. "There is a kind of life one keeps going by any means available. One learns the shape of needs. One also learns the shape of lies," Allean had said gently. "You have a gift for line, Mr. Finch Hatton, but it will not bear scrutiny." He did not ask where the letter had gone. That was another thread in another fabric. Later, in the stillness that follows events, Finch had presented himself with the air of a man submitting to an operation. "I "Removed it, sir," he said. "On my own responsibility. I could not bear that Lady Clarissa's professional correspondence should be made the subject of village talk. It was Miss Hartwell's hand, and the matter of it was injurious to the dignity of both. I burned it." "Mr. Finch," Allean said, and there was something like sympathy in it, "you must never again take such responsibility upon yourself in a matter of this kind." "No, sir," Finch said with perfect humility. "I shall not have the opportunity." Now, as Alistair crossed the threshold between the Blue Saloon and the hall, Mrs. Gable made a small involuntary movement of the hand, the sort of gesture one makes to a child passing out of sight on a first journey. He did not see it. He passed beneath the family portraits as if they were officials at a station, observed, assessed, indifferent. In the gravel sweep, the car waited with its modest finality. Diana Hartwell, summoned discreetly that she might hear what concerned her, had arrived earlier and now stood in the shelter of a clipped yew. She did not triumph. When Allean approached, she inclined her head with a composure that bordered on severity. "I am to be absolved by implication, I suppose," she said. "It is not a process I admire." "It is not a process at all," Allean replied. "You have been wronged in two fashions, Miss Hartwell, once in your work and once in the intention that your work should be made a cloak for something meaner. I cannot address the first. The second I have done my best to set aside." She looked past him to the house with its long windows, where one might have imagined Lady Clarissa's figure passing, precise as a metronome. "There is no pleasure in it," Diana said. "There never was." "No," said Allean. "Only a kind of ending." He watched as Fox assisted Alistair into the car, not ungently, and closed the door with that particular final softness that rank and training had taught him. No handcuffs were produced. The road from Ainsworth Manor descended between high hedges, and the dust rose in a decorous plume behind the departing motor. Finch reappeared with a glass of water for Mrs. Gable, who took it as if it were a sacrament. Allean, with a nod, sent Fox ahead and lingered a moment on the steps, his gaze going without intention to the rose garden below. The paper roses in the studio would be carefully boxed later and, in due time, catalogued. The living roses lifted their faces to the high, indifferent light. "It is the house I pity," Mrs. Hartwell said from the doorway, surprising him with the breadth of her feeling. "It has the memory of her hands in it." "It will retain that," Allean said. "Houses do." He turned then to Finch, who had not moved. "Mr. Finch, there will be statements. They will be taken without drama." "Thank you, sir," Finch said. He added as if to himself, "It is a difficult art, service. It mistakes itself for virtue." "Sometimes it is both," Allean answered. "Sometimes neither." When the car had become a small geometry far down the lane, Diana Hartwell came a step nearer. From her pocket she drew a single flower, not a rose, but a spare, stern chrysanthemum of folded paper, and placed it on the stone balustrade. "Something honest," she said. She did have that at moments. "Yes," Allean said. He did not look at the flower. "At moments." The house resumed its breath. Doors whispered, a clock resumed its unremarkable duty, a maid crossed the far end of a corridor with a tray. In the Blue Saloon, a faint smell of lavender lingered like an old grace. The morning had performed its part. What remained would be for the law to conduct in its quiet fashion and for private consciences to arrange, as best they could among themselves. Allean asked for no ceremony. The drawing-room at Ainsworth Manor had been arranged as if for a quiet hour after dinner, fire in moderation, lamplight carefully judged, a tray waiting at the sideboard. It was a room designed to absorb emotion and return it softened into something genteel. In this, as in other purposes, it did not fail. They came in with the various flavors of their station. Finch, immaculate and spare, stood inconspicuously near the door and might have been carved there. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hartwell kept to the shadows, as servants will when tragedy has leveled its brief republic of feeling and duty has resumed the throne. Fox occupied a chair with the patient solidity of a well-set piece in a game. Diana Hartwell, in a plain dark coat that did nothing to conceal the strength of her features, stood by the window. Alistair Finch Hatton took his place near the hearth, choosing a position that allowed him to manage his profile and the line of his mouth. Allean did not sit at first. He stood with his hands lightly clasped and spoke without the slightest pressure in his voice. "I'm obliged to you all. I've asked you here because a number of small matters, none decisive by themselves, have conspired to a single shape. They will, I think, bear hearing together." There was a gentle movement in the room as people prepared themselves inwardly for something they had foreseen and hoped not to meet. Lady Clarissa, Allean continued, lived by ritual. In such a life, disturbances speak. The jasmine tea that replaced her cocoa, the west window found ajar, the single paper rose crushed beneath her hand. Each appeared trivial, yet each was an intrusion upon habit. There were voices in her studio, a letter that unsettled her, and a scent, a sweetness with an acrid undertone, quite foreign to this house. No one spoke. Diana kept her eyes on the garden. Finch's profile remained composed. "Of the letter," Allean said, and turned to the butler. "Mr. Finch, I believe you can assist us." The butler's expression did not change, and yet, in some way, the room seemed to turn toward him. He inclined his head, left the doorway with his discreet step, and returned with a thin envelope. He brought it to Allean on a small tray, as if it were a cup of coffee. "I removed it on my own responsibility, sir, this morning before your arrival," Finch said. "I beg your pardon for the impropriety. Lady Clarissa would have disliked a scene." Allean took the letter and, without reading from it, supplied its gist. Miss Hartwell wrote to Lady Clarissa with words she has used again this week. People mistake silence for weakness. It was not a threat. It was an invitation to recognition. Lady Clarissa's reply, drafted and not posted, speaks of a wish to make amends in some formal way. There is a mention of a retrospective, of proper attribution, and, here the document is plain, of testamentary adjustments. Alistair's eyes did not move. He had the stillness of a man listening to an account of an unhappy accident, the sort that might be laid at no one's door. "Mrs. Hartwell mentions hearing voices at the studio door on Thursday evening," Allean went on, "and a tray left untouched. The west window, long kept shut, was found ajar next morning. In the studio there was the faint residue of jasmine. The chemist in the village recalls 2 purchases of that essence in a week, one by Miss Hartwell, whom he knows, and one later by a gentleman in a dark coat. He remembers him for a small, old-fashioned courtesy with the door." Alistair's fingers had found his watch chain and left it again. It was a very minor tremor. "The paper rose," Allean said gently. "Was another thing. It was fashioned from a stock Lady Clarissa never used, without the watermark she preferred. Its petals were scored against the grain with a blade that had been held uncertainly and in the wrong hand. There is a left-handed bias in the cut, yes. But it is the bias of someone borrowing a hand for the moment, not the steady habit of a lifetime. Miss Hartwell's work, as you know," he inclined his head toward the window, "leaves its own unmistakable signature. This does not bear it." Fox stirred and produced a small packet from his case. "From Mr. Finch Hatton's motor," he said at Allean's nod. It was a packet of smooth, inexpensive paper, lately opened, with a corner missing. The faint smell of cheap size rose from it, a little sour next to the fire's clean heat. "The village stationer is confident," Allean said, "that he sold this packet yesterday morning to a gentleman who paid in notes and declined a receipt. There is no crime in such purchases. But we find in Lady Clarissa's studio a crushed rose made from the same paper and a small, unfamiliar smear of paste on the bone folder that she would not have left." He let the chain of trivialities settle into the quiet that followed them. "As to the tea," he said after a moment, "Dr. Runciman will give his formal opinion in due course. It will not surprise you to hear that the flavor of jasmine can do something to tame the more obvious signature of prussic acid. One drop in a cup is often enough. The small, acrid note that lingers in the air is not, as Mrs. Gable feared, an omen, but the untidy truth of chemistry." Alistair looked up then and met Alan's gaze with care. "You cannot suppose, says Inspector, this is monstrous, that I would poison my aunt's tea in her own house." "I think," Allean said very quietly, "that you met with Lady Clarissa on Thursday evening, after sending the household the message that she was to be undisturbed. I think she refused what you suggested." The cook heard voices, and the tray waited in the hall. Later, when the servants had withdrawn, the tea was sweetened to a purpose. And when the bitterness of consequence presented itself, you did what clever people often do. You supplied a narrative. You left the window ajar to hint a trespass. You fashioned a rose in an awkward counterfeit of a left hand, and you removed nothing from the desk because Mr. Finch, in his own foolish loyalty, had already done so, though he removed the one document that could have undone the trap you had laid. There was no movement from Finch. Mrs. Hartwell made a small sound and was silent. Allean's tone did not harden. "You have been, Mr. Finch Hatton, a man in difficulties. It is grievous. Debts that will not sleep, investments that would not reawaken. These are cruel things. Your aunt's plan to make public amends would draw attention, invite claims, and alter a will in ways less favorable to you. It is an old story told with new ornaments. But the ornaments this time were paper. They could not bear the weight." Alistair's mouth, which had kept its line throughout, lost it. He looked not at Allean, but at the fire. "I had time to think," he said after a long moment, and his voice was almost conversational. "Weeks in which to consider how a thing might be done without noise. She would not listen on Wednesday. She had decided to humiliate the family, to humiliate my father's memory, in the name of justice to a protégé who turned her grievance into an art. And the police, if I am frank, seemed to prefer their Miss Hartwell. Left-handed, a scent bottle in the cottage, an offence old enough to be crusted over with romance. It would have been tidier, Inspector." "Possibly," said Allean. Diana's hands at the window had not moved. She watched the garden where, in the bare beds, the last leaves had learned an art of their own, a sort of brittle grace. "I did not mean," Alistair began, and then stopped. Words he might have prepared failed him, not dramatically, but as naturally as breath leaving a room. When he raised his head, there was something like relief in his face. May I write to my wife before?" "Of course," said Allean. He gave Fox the smallest of nods, and Fox rose without sound. There was no scene. Alistair drew his coat together and found he had mislaid the habit of squaring his shoulders. He went with Fox without a glance at anyone, and, passing Finch, might have been leaving for London on a wet afternoon. When they were gone, Allean turned to the butler. "Mr. Finch," he said, "this letter should be placed in Dr. Runciman's keeping for the present. Later it may have work to do of another kind." The butler bowed. "Yes, sir." There was no tremor now. Finch had returned to his post. Diana Hartwell closed her hand on the curtain edge. "I wanted only the truth," she said, "not to anyone in particular. It seldom resembles one's plans for it." "It seldom does," Allean agreed. He looked toward the mantel where one of Lady Clarissa's roses stood under a glass shade, immaculate and unchanging. "Your phrase about silence had a hard journey of it." Diana's expression softened, not into any simple satisfaction, but into something like fatigue. "She was not a bad woman," she said after a moment. "Only proud. Pride in a woman is readable like a scar to those who share its cause." There are kinds of reparation that arrive too late for those who offer them, Allean said. Other sorts arrive early enough for those who receive. Her glance answered him without flourish. She did not ask what would be said publicly. She had, he thought, a clear idea of how polite history is written. After a moment she inclined her head and took her leave without sound. The door closed on a small gust of autumn air that smelled of damp leaves and turned earth. When Allean found himself alone again, he moved to the paper rose beneath the shade. It had been fashioned with all the fastidiousness of the life whose end it had watched, each petal cut to a proportion no one would think to praise because it had been there too long to notice. He thought of the poor counterfeit crushed into a signal and a reproach, and of the brutal economy by which men justify themselves with phrases and arrangements, as if human consequence could be folded and refolded until it lay obediently flat. Fox returned after a time and stood by the hearth. "Quietly done, sir," he said. "Quietly enough," Allean answered. He replaced the glass with the same care Finch might have given to a fragile heirloom. "There is a point, Fox, at which tidiness becomes indecency." "Yes, sir." They went out together. In the corridor, the air held a final, faint suggestion of lavender. Beyond the windows, the garden, stripped now of its finery, waited without complaint for whatever the season would give it next. Somewhere, a door latched with the soft certainty of a thing behaving as it always had. Allean thought, "It is not the noise that tells the truth in such houses. It is the alteration in a small habit, the wrong scent at the wrong hour, a window that should have stayed shut, a flower made of the wrong paper. One listens for it and, if one is very patient, hears it." He put on his hat and went out into the pale afternoon, where the leaves lay in thin, exhausted drifts, each shaped delicately as a promise to be kept and then, in time, forgotten.